Catherine will speak on my behalf. Mrs. Meghan Markle has repeatedly written to the palace seeking our intervention in the Epstein matter, but, like Andrew, she must face her own consequences.
The palace did not whisper this time. It answered. And in that answer, every private hope Meghan had carried back toward the monarchy was crushed in a single devastating decision. Charles rejected her final plea for renewed royal access, and the palace confirmed the door was closed. Not delayed, not reconsidered. Closed. Behind that word stood years of pain, silence, pride, and one king who finally refused to bend. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure you subscribe to Royal Zone so you don't miss a single update. Meghan felt the answer before anyone explained it. She sat beside her phone, reading the palace response once, then again, as if a softer meaning might appear between the lines. It did not. The request pushed through official channels had been denied. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's working headquarters where decisions are issued publicly, confirmed Meghan would not be restored to any formal family role. That mattered because this was not a social snub. This was the institution saying she had no official path back. It mattered more because the plea had not been casual. For weeks, her representatives had exchanged messages with aides, searching for limited access, controlled invitations, and one sign that the freeze was ending. Charles carried the file like a burden, not a weapon. The king read the final request inside his private study, where silence made every word feel heavier. He understood that rejecting Meghan would wound Harry too, and that truth made the decision colder, not easier. Yet the monarch knew the crown could not survive on emotion alone. Royal access, meaning the right to attend protected family events and communicate through palace channels, had become too dangerous to reopen. Charles set the file down, tired, because this was not a moment of triumph. It was an admission. Something had broken, and the king no longer believed words could fix it. William's influence rested over the decision before the ink had even dried. A sealed note attached to the file suggested the prince had been consulted, and that detail changed the atmosphere in the room. William did not need to raise his voice to shape the outcome. His concern was already inside the wording. The confirmation used firm language, and aides understood at once that this was not a pause, not a cooling period, not a door left open. It was a permanent line. Before the palace could control the shock, one question began moving through the corridors. What exactly had Meghan asked for that made Charles close the door so completely? And to understand why this rejection cut so deeply, the story must move from the palace statement to the people whose lives were trapped inside it. This was never just about access. It was about pride, memory, betrayal, and the unbearable weight of being told that a family door no longer opens. Meghan stood on one side of the divide, still believing there was one final sentence that could change everything. Charles stood on the other, carrying the burden of kingship, and William waited in silence, knowing one wrong move could reopen every wound. Meghan read the palace reply twice, and the second reading hurt more than the first. She had not asked to return as a full working royal, meaning a senior family member expected to carry out official duties on behalf of the crown. She had asked for something smaller, but emotionally much larger. Selected family moments, controlled appearances, and a sign that she was no longer frozen out. That mattered because public exclusion had become part of her story. It also mattered because every closed invitation reminded the world that the split was not healed, only managed. Charles felt the weight differently. The king wanted to be seen as a father who could forgive. But the monarch also had to protect the institution, meaning the system of royal duties, public trust, and palace order that survives beyond one family argument. He told a senior aide in a private documented account that the rejection was painful because it pushed Harry further away. Charles did not say it with anger. He said it with the tired voice of a man who understood what the crown sometimes demanded. A sacrifice from the heart, before it asked anything from the hand. William's role became harder to ignore once aides compared the final wording with remarks the prince had made in an earlier private meeting. The language was calm, but the meaning was firm. Meghan's return, even in a limited way, could reopen old wounds for Catherine, unsettle the children, and pull the monarchy back into a storm it had barely survived. William had watched the family suffer through accusations, silence, and public pressure. He did not want revenge. He wanted a clear boundary, and Charles, reading the same fear in his son's careful words, understood why the future king would not move. Camilla supported the rejection quietly, but the queen consort feared what might come after it. She knew Meghan could turn silence into a weapon if the closed door became a public battle. Camilla had survived enough royal storms to recognize the danger in a wounded person with nothing left to lose. Meghan, meanwhile, stared at the reply with disbelief slowly fading into stillness, as if the last hope of return had been taken from her hands. The palace had not only refused her plea, it had removed the hope behind it. Yet the real reason behind Charles's refusal did not begin with Meghan's final message. It began with one earlier incident that turned the palace's patience into suspicion. Because long before Charles rejected the plea, one private royal moment had already made forgiveness feel impossible. Every royal rupture has a moment everyone later remembers differently, but no one forgets. For Meghan and the palace, that moment came during a private Windsor remembrance reception, when a quiet conversation turned sharp. An aide stepped away pale, and William's expression changed in front of everyone. From that night forward, the question was no longer whether Meghan could return. It was whether the family would ever trust her again. Meghan felt the exclusion before anyone explained it. She had been left out of a family-only balcony appearance, meaning a public moment where selected members of the royal family stand together above the crowd as a sign of unity. That mattered because a balcony place was never just a place to stand. It was a message. It told the public who belonged inside the royal circle and who had been pushed beyond it. Meghan saw that absence as deliberate, and the hurt hardened quickly into anger. She challenged palace aides after the remembrance reception, demanding to know why she had been removed from a moment she believed still touched her family. William watched the exchange become something darker. The prince had already carried years of public tension, but this moment felt different, because it happened after a solemn ceremony, when restraint was expected, and grief still hung over the family. He heard Meghan press the aides, and he saw one of them step away, pale, shaken by the force of the confrontation. William did not see a woman asking for fairness. He saw proof that image, position, and control still sat dangerously close to every royal wound. Meghan felt humiliated, but he felt alarmed, and that difference became the crack neither side could cross. Charles saw it from across the room, and his face changed before he even spoke. The king understood what a remembrance reception meant. A private gathering after a public ceremony, where the family honors loss, duty, and shared history away from the cameras. That was why the timing mattered so much. The monarch had hoped grief might soften old bitterness. Instead, he watched resentment rise in the very place meant to quiet it. Charles did not interrupt at first. He simply watched. And in that silence, he understood that the family was no longer dealing with one request, one invitation, or one complaint. It was dealing with trust itself. A palace aide later placed a written account of the Windsor incident into a confidential file, meaning a restricted record prepared for senior royal review. The account did not soften the moment. It preserved it. It described Meghan's words clearly. "You cannot erase me and expect silence." Those words unsettled the household because they sounded less like pain and more like a warning. Meghan may have meant them as self-defense, but the palace heard danger. That line followed the file all the way to Charles's desk, and when the king read it again, the confrontation everyone feared became unavoidable. So when Meghan's final plea reached the monarch, it carried not just words of return, it carried the echo of the night Windsor changed everything. The confrontation did not happen before cameras. It happened behind closed doors, where every breath mattered and every pause sounded like judgment. Charles sat at the head of the room, Meghan's request placed before him, while William stood near the window, silent but completely unmovable. No speeches, no ceremony. Just a king, a future king, and the final question no one could soften. Should Meghan be allowed back in? Charles knew every person in that room understood the weight of what was coming. The king had called the private meeting after Meghan's final plea reached his desk, choosing to decide the matter before it leaked into headlines and forced the palace into panic. A private meeting in royal terms meant a closed discussion with only trusted figures present, where decisions could be shaped before becoming public. That mattered because one leak could turn a family wound into a media explosion. It also mattered because Meghan's request was not small. She wanted restored invitations to selected royal family events, limited palace communication access, and one public signal that the freeze around her name had finally ended. William stayed quiet until the wording became the battle. The prince heard Charles hesitate over the word rejected, and he understood why his father hated it. The word was cruel. It sounded final. It left no soft landing. But William also knew that softer language would create false hope, and false hope had already cost the family too much. He reminded the king that Catherine had carried years of pressure without turning private pain into public war. He reminded him that the children had been dragged into storms they never chose. William's anger did not explode. It settled low in his voice, controlled and unmistakable. Charles removed his glasses, and the room changed. The monarch pressed his fingers to the page as if the paper itself had become too heavy to hold. He did not look victorious. He looked wounded. Meghan's plea had reached him as a request for return. But to the king, it also carried the memory of every accusation, every silence, every broken attempt at peace. Charles understood that royal communication access meant permission to speak through protected palace channels, and reopening that path could blur the boundary the monarchy had fought so hard to restore. The king finally looked down at the file and said, "Then we close it." An aide moved before anyone else spoke. He slid forward a draft palace statement that had already been prepared, and that quiet gesture told the room something chilling. Someone had expected Charles to reach this decision before the king even said it out loud. William saw it. Charles saw it too. The statement was not emotional. It was sharp, controlled, and built to end all discussion. Meghan would not be named with cruelty, but she would be denied with certainty. The shock was not only that Charles rejected her, the shock was how quickly the power behind that rejection began to show itself. And once the statement left that room, it became clear that this was no ordinary family refusal. This was royal authority, moving with surgical precision. Power inside the monarchy rarely announces itself. It moves through tone, timing, and the silence of people who already know the outcome. Charles signed the decision, but William's influence hung over every line. The rejection carried the king's authority. Yet the future king's restraint shaped its edges. And in the palace, that combination felt more final than anger. It felt like succession speaking before the crown had even changed hands. Charles sat quietly after signing the final wording, staring at the bottom of the page as if the ink had taken something from him. The palace machinery moved fast now, meaning the private offices, senior aides, and communication staff who turn a royal decision into an official public message. That mattered because speed protected control. It also mattered because hesitation would invite leaks, rumors, and another wave of public pressure. The king had approved a firm confirmation, not a vague family statement, and everyone around him understood the difference. A vague statement could breathe. This one was built to end the air in the room. William spoke carefully, but pain moved through every word. The prince's position was clear. Meghan's return, even limited and polished, could destabilize Catherine, unsettle the children, and shake the fragile public trust the monarchy had worked so hard to rebuild. That trust mattered because the family had already survived years of accusations, distance, and emotional public battles. It mattered because every new royal crack became a national argument before the family could even feel it privately. William did not speak like a man chasing punishment. He spoke like a brother who had accepted that Harry might move further away if the door stayed closed. Charles heard the name and looked down. Harry was the wound inside the decision, and the king knew it. Rejecting Meghan meant more than refusing one plea. It meant accepting that his son could read the refusal as a rejection of the life he had chosen. Charles did not defend himself with grand words. He simply stayed still, carrying the cost. William noticed that stillness and softened his voice, but he did not change his position. The prince believed the monarchy could not keep reopening the same door just because the pain outside it had not faded. Camilla's absence from the final decision spoke louder than her presence ever could. A senior courtier noticed that Charles did not ask the queen consort for her final opinion, and that detail moved quietly through the room. Camilla supported the rejection, but the choice belonged to the king and the heir alone. The phrase inside the statement made that clear. No further pathway to formal reintegration. Formal reintegration meant a structured return to royal recognition, duties, or protected family access. Palace staff understood the words instantly. They were carefully chosen, polished, and unmistakable. Meghan was not being paused. Meghan was being closed out. The statement left the room with discipline, but discipline could not soften what it carried. Charles had signed as monarch. William had shaped it as heir. Camilla had watched from the edge of influence. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, Meghan was about to receive a decision that would not feel like policy, order, or duty. It would feel personal. Every closed door creates an echo. And the first person to feel that echo was not Charles or William. It was Meghan. Because while the palace moved with discipline, she received the decision as something far more personal than policy. There are moments when a person does not need anyone to explain what has happened. Meghan knew the meaning before she reached the final line. The wording was too clean, too cold, too deliberate. It did not invite negotiation. It did not leave room for any dignity-saving ambiguity. It told her, in the careful language of monarchy, that the chapter she had tried to reopen had been shut from the other side. Meghan received the final palace response through a private channel before the public confirmation appeared. A private channel meant a controlled line of communication, used to deliver sensitive decisions before they reached the press. That mattered because it gave her only minutes to absorb the rejection before the world began judging it. It also mattered because the palace wanted control, not conversation. The reply made clear that future royal attendance, internal palace contact, and symbolic restoration were all denied. Royal attendance meant permission to appear at family-linked events under palace approval, while symbolic restoration meant any public sign that she had been welcomed back into the royal circle. Meghan gripped the edge of the table as she read. She did not cry at first. That was what made the moment even heavier. The shock sat still on her face, turning into something colder as every line removed another possibility. No future invitation, no protected palace contact, no carefully worded return. Meghan had asked for a small opening, but the answer treated even that small opening as too dangerous. The refusal struck at more than access. It touched her pride, her identity, and the story she had built around being more than someone the palace could push outside. Harry watched her reaction and understood the damage before she even spoke. He had seen Meghan angry before, and he had seen her wounded. But this silence frightened him more than both. Harry knew the decision was not just a palace matter. It reached into their marriage, their public image, and the painful space between his old family and his new life. He asked whether there was still someone he could call: Charles, a senior aide, anyone who might explain the wording or soften the blow. Meghan did not answer at once, and that silence told him the truth. Meghan paused at one phrase. The family position is settled. Those words cut differently. They told her that more than Charles had spoken through the response. The king's authority was there, but William's restraint was there too. Harry saw her eyes stop on that sentence, and he knew she understood it. This was not one man's hesitation. This was a family boundary shaped into palace language. The phrase sounded calm, but beneath it sat a verdict. No more appeals, no more back doors, no one left to persuade. Harry lowered his voice, but Meghan had already moved beyond the question. He could call, but calling would not reopen what had been closed. She could fight, but fighting would only prove the palace right. For the first time, Meghan seemed to understand that the door had not been slammed in anger. It had been locked with discipline, and in that silence between them, the story shifted from rejection to reckoning, forcing Charles and Meghan toward one final private human moment. Before the world could turn the decision into headlines, two people on opposite sides of the divide had to face what had been lost. The turning point came not with a palace statement, but with a voice on a private line. No aides, no advisors, no carefully polished phrases. Just Charles and Meghan, separated by years of accusations and unmet expectations, speaking after the decision had already been made. It was not a negotiation. It was not a reconciliation. It was something colder and sadder. The final courtesy before the door stayed closed. Charles agreed to the call because silence would have made the rejection feel even harder. The king knew Meghan had already received the formal answer, but he also knew the human pain behind it could not be handled only through palace wording. A formal rejection meant an official refusal issued through approved royal channels, not a private family conversation. That mattered because the decision carried royal authority. But the wound was personal. It also mattered because Meghan had not only asked for access, she had asked, in her own way, to be seen again by the family she believed had pushed her outside. Meghan answered with control, but control did not hide the hurt. She did not begin with anger. She asked Charles one question that cut through every palace phrase. Was there ever a version of her return he could have accepted? The king paused long enough for the answer to hurt before he spoke. Meghan heard that pause and understood it before the words even arrived. Charles told her he could not rebuild trust by announcement. Trust in this moment meant more than forgiveness. It meant confidence that private family pain would not become public pressure again. And the monarch no longer had that confidence. Charles did not speak like a man seeking victory. He spoke like a father trapped inside a crown. Meghan absorbed his words with controlled grief, not open rage, and that restraint made the call feel even heavier. She had expected refusal from the institution, but hearing it from the king made it sharper. Charles told her, "This is not punishment. It is protection." That sentence revealed everything. The palace had not framed the rejection as revenge. It had framed it as a shield, around William, Catherine, the children, and the fragile calm the monarchy had fought to rebuild. Meghan did not beg again. That was the moment the call changed. She simply said she understood what the family had chosen, and in those words, her final plea surrendered its last breath. Charles heard the quiet in her voice and knew the damage had landed. Meghan heard the firmness in his and knew the decision would not bend. No aide softened it. No advisor translated it. No palace machine stood between them. For the first time in the entire crisis, the wound spoke directly to the crown. Charles ended the call knowing mercy had not changed the outcome. Meghan ended it knowing dignity was all she had left to protect. The king had given her one final courtesy, but not one final chance. And once that call ended, the monarchy could no longer hide behind private language. The closed door had moved from paper to voice, from policy to pain, from family tension to public consequence. And when the news broke beyond palace walls, the rejection became more than a family decision. It became a national spectacle. By morning, the private rejection had become a public image. Britain woke to a single brutal phrase printed across front pages, repeated by broadcasters, and debated outside palace gates. The story no longer belonged to Charles or Meghan. It belonged to the nation, watching a royal door close in real time. And for once, the palace did not chase the noise. It let the silence speak. Charles watched the coverage briefly, and the longer he watched, the heavier the decision felt. The palace confirmation had spread across major broadcasts before breakfast, and commentators framed it as the strongest signal yet that Meghan would not be formally welcomed back. A palace confirmation meant an official message released through royal communication channels, carrying the weight of the monarchy rather than private gossip. That mattered because it changed the rejection from a family answer into a public position. It also mattered because the monarchy had chosen firmness over emotional explanation, allowing the world to hear the ending without seeing the pain behind it. Meghan saw the headline and looked away. She had known the answer was final, but seeing it turned into public language made the wound sharper. The story dominated morning discussion because it carried everything people could not stop watching: family pain, royal authority, exile, pride, and the dream of return being crushed in one sentence. Meghan was not only hurt by the rejection, she was hurt by how quickly the world reduced her private disappointment into a spectacle. The headline did not hold her grief. It held the drama, and that difference cut deep. The front page outside Victoria Station became the image everyone remembered. A newspaper board displayed the words, "Palace door closed. King ends Meghan return bid." Victoria Station, one of London's busiest transport hubs, mattered because thousands of ordinary people passed that headline before the palace had even issued a second word. The rejection had left royal rooms and entered daily life. Commuters stopped, stared, took photos, and moved on. That was the cruelty of public history. One family's fracture became something strangers could read between trains. Charles turned the television off before the commentators finished speaking. The king could face duty, but he struggled to watch private pain become national judgment. He understood why the story held the country so tightly. It was not only about Meghan. It was about whether the monarchy could forgive without weakening itself, and whether a king could protect the crown without losing more of his family. Charles had made the decision, but the public reaction reminded him that no royal choice stays private for long. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the railings. Buckingham Palace, the central working home of the monarch, mattered because people came there when they wanted to witness royal history with their own eyes. Some stood silently, some filmed. One woman looked toward the gates and said, "That sounded final." Her words captured the mood better than any broadcast panel. Meghan had been denied. Charles had stood firm. William's influence had been felt, and the palace had allowed the silence to confirm what the statement did not soften. But beyond public reaction, the real verdict had to be measured inside the family itself, where the meaning of the decision finally settled. Because headlines could describe the rejection, but only the final emotional aftermath could reveal what it truly meant. In the end, the palace did not merely reject a plea, it chose an identity. Charles chose the crown over another round of fragile compromise. William chose protection over sentiment. Meghan faced the end of a hope she had not fully admitted she still carried. And Harry was left standing between love and family ties, knowing the door had closed with a sound no one in the family could pretend not to hear. Charles understood the cost once the noise faded. The king had drawn the clearest boundary yet between private family feeling and public royal responsibility. Public royal responsibility meant the duty to protect the monarchy's image, order, and stability, even when personal emotions pull in another direction. That mattered because the crown could not look uncertain every time old wounds returned. It also mattered because Meghan's plea had placed the family at a dangerous crossroads. Reopen the door and risk more chaos, or close it and accept the pain that followed. Charles chose pain with control over comfort with chaos. Charles stood alone with the signed file, and for one quiet second, the decision looked heavier than the throne itself. The king placed it into a drawer and rested his hand on it, not as a man celebrating victory, but as a father accepting loss. He knew this rejection would shape his reign. A reign meant the period in which a monarch rules. And for Charles, this moment showed that his rule would not survive on softness alone. He had absorbed personal sadness to protect the institution, and that sacrifice left him burdened, not proud. Meghan accepted the truth slowly, and that was where the pain lived. She knew the plea had been her final attempt. The answer had not left space for another request, another call, another carefully worded appeal. Meghan had not been erased, but she had been denied the palace-approved return she once imagined might still be possible. That distinction mattered because her story would continue outside royal walls, but not with royal permission. Harry understood it too. He knew the rejection had not removed her from public attention, but it had ended any official road back into the family's formal world. William's influence marked the deeper shift. The prince was no longer simply reacting to royal crises after they exploded. He was shaping how they ended. That mattered, because the future king had begun to act like the monarchy's next shield, not merely its next symbol. William had chosen protection over sentiment, and Charles had accepted that choice because the family could not keep mistaking mercy for repair. The door had stayed open in memory for too long. Now it had closed, in policy, in language, and in the hearts of those who understood what the decision truly meant. Harry stood between love and family ties, and there was no easy place left for him to stand. Meghan was wounded. Charles was burdened. William was firm in his position, and the royal family was permanently changed. The emotional verdict was clear. The monarchy chose closure over confusion, discipline over drama, and survival over sentiment. It did not heal the family. It did not erase the past. But it ended the illusion that every broken bond could be restored by one final plea. The door was closed, and this time, everyone heard it. Thanks for watching Royal Zone. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to Royal Zone so you never miss an update, and we will see you in the next one.